the Green Dialogue. And I want to thank Sam for inviting Norm, a fellow landscape architect. Most of you know that Norm and his Greenways Collaborative helped Meridian Township. I can't believe it's been 20 years since we helped develop a green space plan. I thought it was only over a decade, but so glad you can make it, Norm. Norm calls himself a Planscape Archineer, and he and his firm have helped dozens of communities, local, state, county, regional governments, Michigan State University, other universities, school systems, do work with designing landscapes and communities that work for people. And of course, you all know that Meridian prides itself on being a green community. And I've got a strong hunch that one of the reasons we're still attractive community is because of some of the work that Norm has helped us with. So I'm going to hand it over and let Norm do the talking, but welcome everybody.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Good to see a bunch of familiar faces here. Yeah, I was surprised myself when I looked back and saw May 6, 2004 as the final date on the plan. And I'm like, okay, that's a 20-year-old plan, which is long past the shelf life of most plans. And so I should note that as I kind of went back and was looking at this plan, that you all are probably much more familiar with it than I am, in the sense of you're using it and referencing it more than I am. And I had to kind of go back and spend some time looking at the plan. And then I went and kind of looked at what you're doing in your current plans and recreation plans and master plans and whatnot, and just trying to see, how is this being used or referenced, or how are things progressing with the community? So I have to profess a fair amount of ignorance of what has been going on in the township over the past 20 years and tried to do a little catch up in preparation of this meeting. But with the spirit of the title of this, the dialogue, would really like to kind of hear a lot from you, as well as me just talking to you, just how it has worked and not worked. And I should also note that this product, or this plan, was really a product of its time. And I went back and said, okay, 20 years ago, what was happening? Conservation zoning was really all the rage. You go to a conference and there was, presentations by Randall Arndt, and she knew some of the people that kind of worked on some of those publications, and that was a key thing. Farmland preservation, rural character preservation, that was kind of a key element. That was something that we also tried to work into the plan. A thing that was also happening was idea of density. What does density look like? And I'm not talking so much about the high rise versus single family, but really all the variations within a single family type development. We have all these residential classifications and zoning, and we say R1, R2, R3. Everyone has a assumption of what that looks like. And there was a lot of work back then photographing, calculating the density of areas and photographing what these different densities look like. And the idea is you probably couldn't guess it just by looking at it. And that kind of ties back to the whole conservation zoning. And I think that's still an issue today. Anytime someone wants to change something of like what this idea was. And I think we started this business in '93. Even 20 years ago, non-motorized transportation planning was still pretty much in its early stages. There was more of a focus on off-road trails. Getting things in the kind of everyday transportation in the roads was something that communities are just beginning to really start to address. We are very limited on what we could do. on road facilities compared to today. Getting a bike lane in was kind of a radical thing. And of course, you being a township, not having control over the roadways, there was challenges in there. So as I kind of look back, I'm like, okay, that's somewhat of the context of this plan as it was put together. And so a lot of those things that were the hot topics and the interest areas were what this plan was trying to address. And I would say one of the things I want to just kind of go through a few things in the plan later on that came around, but I want to just kind of talk about briefly maybe what would be some of the things we do differently this time around. Um, and then historically, plans from this era, this type, how have they fared? Not just your plan, but kind of how we've seen these plans in general. And then a few observations and kind of the conversation of how I've seen or how this plan has fared, what has worked and what has not worked. Um, and if I look back of this plan of what we would maybe do differently, and I would say, if I'm not sure if any of you kind of looked at this, and I could pull up a few images, but one of the core elements of this was a ecological analysis. And I should say that was another thing that was kind of a big thing that a lot of communities were doing. Davy Tree started doing these around a lot of communities in Michigan. Uh, their group with MSU was kind of doing a separate ecological assessment for the township for the land purchase, as we were doing the ecological assessment for this, and we weren't allowed to see each other's data, or at least we weren't allowed to see the other assessment. Fortunately, I think they fairly aligned well. Um, and when I went back and I looked at the ecological assessment of the things we did in that, uh, all the things you might think about with, riparian and wetlands and uh, things about looking at edge habitat versus interior habitat. One of the things that was really missing from the research library for us to reference at that time was just what is a good ecological corridor holistically. Now, you could get all kinds of information on what is a best ecological, habitat or corridor for a grizzly bear or a sparrow. Very individual species type things, but more holistically, there just wasn't a lot of good science and papers that we could reference. So we were trying to do our best with that. But the one thing that I would say that if I look back and then it gave me a little bit of unease even 20 years ago, we used this rarity uh, element where we said, okay, how rare is a particular plant association based on a 25-mile area context for Meridian Township? And the idea was, okay, we want to preserve some kind of unusual plant associations. And it's something kind of always kind of stuck with me. We didn't make it a huge centerpiece of the rating system, but in retrospect, looking back at this, ecological associations represent what's going on in the groundwater and the soils and all that. And maybe that wasn't such an important thing to focus on when we were kind of doing our ecological assessment. Now, this has nothing to do with threatened endangered species. That's a whole nother thing that needs to be addressed. But I think going back to the whole idea of preserving good, generally functioning wildlife corridors, that that maybe was a little bit of unnecessary rating in having just representational um, associations that match what's going on with the site conditions and the conditions in the township is just fine. Now throw in global warming and the challenges our existing associations are facing, plant associations facing with climate change. I think that's something just keeping and maintaining and allowing the ability for our plant associations to adapt to the changing climate is really kind of the key aspect of things. So that was, I went back and I looked at the Ecological Association assessment. I'm like, okay, that probably held up fairly well. I would tweak a few things and go back and look at some research, and maybe we'd be allowed to look at what the other assessment was doing and how they compared. Um, a couple other things I looked at uh, were um, we had talked about a wildlife reflector warning system. We're dealing with a lot of deer crashes. And I'm like, oh, I wonder, that was kind of in this early days of things of trying to prevent deer crashes. And I said, I haven't heard much about that in 20 years. And went back and looked at a few more papers. And recently they've done some more research on those systems and don't seem to have worked particularly well. Matter of fact, one of my favorite research was they would bag these reflective things. I should say the idea is when a car is going down a road, it would hit headlights would hit these reflectors, and that would deter a deer from crossing the road. And when they would bag some of these reflectors to stop them from working to see how it would work, the actual white canvas bags did more to deter crossing than the reflectors. So that was one of those, well, maybe that was a technology that never really panned out. But we also talked about the underpasses for wildlife in that. And that's something that was crazy talk. I remember proposing this to a MDOT at a long range transportation plan 30 some years ago. And they thought the idea of wildlife underpasses were and overpasses insane. But now it's become kind of general practice. Uh, the other thing looked at, of course, on-road bicycle accommodations, as we mentioned earlier, things we could do now with two-way cycle tracks, protected bike lanes, and all these different things within the road corridor, totally different things. So that's something that you could look at if this gets done, beyond just a safety path or a bike lane, many things to look at. But the thing that I would look at that where I would say the plan really could have used more strength, and this will kind of get into maybe some of the self-criticisms on this plan, is a stronger focus on prioritization. We talked about trails, but which trails should be built first and really focusing on that. What programs, we talked about a lot of different conservation programs and elements, but really doing a distilled effort of, okay, of all these different things, or the next 5 years, you really should try to get this, that, and these three things on the ground and up and functioning. We talked about fragile links of this greenway system. We identified those and talked about the different conservation approaches for those. But of all those fragile links, which ones would be the ones to focus on? Really, an action plan. And so if this was the master plan of how to go about things and here are the tools, those would be the things that I look back, uh, things that could really strengthen things. And I want to just share a couple um, items here. I'm going to, let's see if I get yeah. Just wanted to share a couple maps with you, and a lot of things get lost in the appendix. And I went back and I looked at this, and just a couple maps I thought are worth kind of revisiting or just showing that kind of give you the context of how we got to where we were. This is one of my favorite ones of the sewer system coverage versus septic suitability. And the red is basically severe septic deficiencies. And what it's telling you is where the sewer system wasn't, really very little should be building septic systems. And I'm not sure if this has changed at all on, what is going on in the area. as far as the sewer system expanded. And the other one that was kind of a fun analysis to do was the development index of looking at the parcels and how they are broken up now as far as houses per site, and saying, well, how much more could they be subdivided? And we took out the gray areas that really were pretty all built up subdivisions. It was kind of interesting as I compare this to some of the parcels you've acquired over 20 years. And I think there's some tie to that. Prime farmland, a lot of the undeveloped area uh, was fairly significant as far as its farmland, especially if you drained it, and that kind of relates well to the septic suitability. But I think this was one of the more interesting things is once we took out all the land that was been primarily developed, um, a lot of it already fell under a certain degree of regulation. And so in some ways, the whole green space plan had a lot going for it right in from the get-go between the, wetlands, a lot of the potentially developed lands were already under some degree of protection. So that was one of the kind of couple key things. And looking at the ecological assessment of the corridors, this is just kind of a recap of some of the things we were talking about. The basis for the whole ecological corridors. This was our ecological assessment. We also got into the cultural element. You see these with the blue lines of the scenic country roads with the hedgerows of trying to preserve that element. So those were what kind of led into this priority conservation corridors. In this map, kind of out of the main plan itself, basically said once we define these green corridors, we identified in red, these are the areas that really don't have any regulation protecting a significant green space corridor. And those were the areas that really kind of needed some focus to kind of preserve that green space in the community. So just wanted to kind of share a few of those things. And oh, I just see someone. Oh, okay. It was just sharing the link to the plan there. So those are just a couple of the maps as I went back and looked at things 20 years ago of, okay, what would I do different, and some of the things I found interesting. And then I thought historically how these plans fared. And, quite frankly, we did a few of these open space plans, some for places further up north, different character. But we have not seen a lot of this whole conservation, holistic greenway and trail planning efforts. They seem to have fallen out of favor. At least we haven't seen a lot of them. And I think a lot of the greenways, when we started our work and started our company some years ago, it was the idea of these corridors that might have a trail with them. And I think there's been almost a shifting to the idea of trails synonymous with greenways rather than the open space corridors. And when we look at green space plans or zoning, sadly, I think a lot of it seems to be more piecemeal. Yes, there's conservation stuff, but it's that site plan that's going in front of a community, setting aside open space within that site plan in isolation, rather than a more holistic look at how that corridor ties with the corridor of the parcel next to it and further on. And that's kind of something I've seen in multiple communities as we work on different plans, like non-motorized transportation plans that may have nothing to do with open space, or even finding that their open space regulations prohibit paved trails through them. And we also see a lot of still pushback of linking neighborhoods with trails as they develop. And I think this is something anyone who's involved in community planning is uh, no one who is living in a neighborhood wants the developing neighborhood next to it attached to theirs, because somehow those new people are going to come in and destroy everything. And that's still a challenge of linking, even with, forget about roads, a pathway between neighborhoods. Um, Even though once they're there, they want to kind of get to one place to another. The exception, now I've kind of talked about the negative, but one thing that seemed to has really gone forward is the big purchases for green space. And I think the township itself, as well as other areas, there's been a lot of focus on the big purchasing of, large 100, 200 acre parcels uh, in trying to establish and preserve farmland through conservation easements, or preserve or take the land into a parks area. And we've seen a lot of that within a single community, but also multiple communities working together on these, coordinating their purchases. Ann Arbor has a program where they decide we're going to densify the downtown, but we're going to try to preserve the farmland and work with the surrounding townships. So we're seeing a lot of land going into preservation, but maybe not as coordinated with the smaller kind of green belt or smaller greenways. And I think one of the things that maybe we all noticed with the pandemic is uh, wildlife coming back into the communities. That was I think everyone seemed to notice a lot more species in their communities that they had seen previous with the kind of the change in transportation. So I think that's kind of a loss that I've seen of, we're not doing the little stuff, we're doing the big stuff, but maybe not the smaller coordinated little links. Um, and so those were um, a couple things that, when I looked at Meridian Township's plan, uh, it seemed that that followed the same pattern. When I looked at things that the parcels you have purchased over 20 years, really significant parcels. Many of them seem to align with the corridors in some of the green space that we identified in the plan that was also identified in the other ecological assessments. And so a lot of acreage, but maybe not so much the little corridors. You're making great progress on the MSU to Lake Lansing Trail Connector. And maybe that was, the focus of, prioritize the township itself. This is what we're going to work on. And there were some really hard sections that took a while. And even like that final link up the MSU, kind of going behind all the apartments along the Red Cedar. We knew it wasn't going to be an easy trail, but congratulations on making the progress on that. The one thing I guess I've opened up a question is, we didn't see any overlay zoning come out of this plan. Um, and I would be curious to see, I was kind of looking at your zoning, maybe I just missed something, but uh, when working with developers, is it more of a look at this and reference this versus an overlay zoning with kind of the traditional conservation zoning of cluster, what you would be allowed to build in the site and stay out of these areas? And has that been done more on a volunteer site by site basis versus a overlay zoning? So that was kind of one of the big questions I had for you, and also some of the different stewardship programs we outlined, and did those ever go anywhere, some of the volunteer stewardship. And so those are kind of some of my key questions as I went through this, and really want to hear from you what has worked, what hasn't worked, and kind of your take from the people who are actually dealing with this on a daily basis, so we know how to do these plans better next time around. So,
Thank you for that excellent overview. I think Tim or Brian can probably answer that question. And there's another piece in the chat window as
Yeah,
well.
I mean, Norm, I think the interesting thing is that a lot of the stuff that ended up not really being zoning related that came out of this, in my mind. I mean, we have, a pathway plan got developed, and an amendment to our wetland setback ordinance got developed, and the urban service boundary got put into place, and like all these other things that functionally came out of this. I think what this plan did, in my mind, and I wasn't here coming in afterwards, what this plan did in a lot of ways is solidify a lot of the thoughts that we had in the community of how we were going to preserve things going forward, because it still gets referenced. If a project comes in and there's a reference, if the property is referenced as having a corridor or an important linkage on it, that's absolutely brought up in the planning process. And the expectation is that, you're probably gonna get your butt kicked if you take something forward that's taking that out. So it's interesting. They didn't really go the implementation route of establish a formal overlay. I think part of that is, we, especially now, have gotten to the point, and I've beat this drum a lot, is, we're really close to being almost entirely a redevelopment community. I mean, the open space that remains to actually build new subdivisions and things like that on is negligible. I mean, there's very little single family property left. To your point on the map that's in there about the sewage, the sewer and septic suitability, that's played out. I mean, there are those areas of the township generally are large lot, single family homes outside the urban service boundary, not going to get sewer and water service. And so the density is not going to happen out there. It's interesting to me how, like, you raise the point of it not being necessarily as specific from an implementation perspective. And I don't disagree. That's one of those things that, like, every plan, right? You have the hardest time, like, getting the specific, here's how to do the implementation. But this one just sort of like has gotten its tendrils into a little bit of everything. And I think that's why in our master plan this year, we realized, okay, we've got a 20-year history. It definitely needs updated. But there's a lot of things that have happened that can take some credit from this plan sort of laying the boundary. And so I think it's time for us to update it and really reiterate again, I think some of the things we've talked about of if we're going to protect these areas, it's time to further focus on the corridors and increase the density and increase the development on those corridors that are already developed, so that it's way easier for us to then set aside those areas that are environmentally impactful. A lot of you mentioned the environmental stewardship program. I mean, that has grown up in the last, I would say, 10 years under Parks Department. It's taken off. I mean, we have amazing environmental stewardship programmers and people working on that, and a lot of stuff gets done on that on a daily basis. In fact, we're in prescribed burn season right now. We had a couple yesterday. I think there's one coming next week, Delta Dental. And so that, like, which stuff like that you'd never think of in a built up community, but that's become part of spring, and Meridian Township is prescribed burns for specific natural areas within the community, which kind of blows my mind a little bit that has become as accepted as it is around here. And I know part of it was kind of foisted upon the neighborhood in one circumstance, but that was, people, they understand it and they appreciate it, and they see the benefit of it in the long run when it's the Delta Dental one, especially, that, as that gets burned and then comes back, it's gorgeous because it's all native stuff. And people recognize it as that feels like Michigan. So that's, it's interesting. That's kind of where we're at right now. I at some point we'll have to put together like a list of things that have really come out of this, because I really do think it just like got a lot of people thinking in the right direction. And we started to then just pick things off outside of the plan. The plan just became the the guiding light in many ways.
You know, it's interesting you talk about, you know, the prairies and the burning and the kind of appreciation of the native plants and landscape is really grown dramatically over the past 20 years. It's just a general community awareness. And I doubt we had any reference to burning prairies in the plan.
Exactly.
Would have been considered kind of crazy at that point.
But it's one of those things that like once people started to like, this was the mindset that, you know, we're going to protect these natural areas and we like native, like that became a natural thing of, oh, well, if we're going to focus on native plants and we're going to focus on preservation, like this is something that can fit into that portfolio. And it wasn't, I would argue it became not nearly as hard of a sell because it was sort of baked into our DNA as a community to think about things like that. The deer example you gave, you know, we went a slightly different direction there, and that we have the largest cull, I think, in the state of Michigan on a yearly basis, supported by DNR, largely because of the chronic wasting that was found here a while back. But yeah, some of that stuff, it's interesting to hear that the reflective study that it didn't really do much, because I remember when that was a big thing on certain roads that you it should help, yeah, but it didn't.
It didn't.
What other questions or observations do people have? Feel free to raise your hand or just unmute yourself.
Oh, I see Sarah's hand up. Or, oh, sorry, that's not Sarah's. That was my little cursor.
I do wonder, and I'm just curious to your thoughts with the amount of wetlands that were originally here decades a long time ago to what we have now. If you think the wetlands being here is part of what has helped keep it greener and greener longer, less development, if the wetlands just, that restricted space and it's
Totally.
not allowed, but it's also not easy to build on a wetland or to do whatever the term is to affect it so that you can, whatever the word is, where you can make it so that you can build on it. But do you think that that has helped make this community be able to stay greener?
Oh, totally. And I think that was our big surprise when we did that. If I showed that map of, we did this whole ecological assessment and we drew these corridors and then we said, well, what's not protected? And really most of the corridors were already in some level of protection from the wetlands. So the Michigan wetland law did wonders. Obviously you had agricultural drainage, that took out some of those early on, but probably definitely way more than anything that was in this plan, just the nature of the township and how difficult it is to build or get in these days, a septic permit on some of these areas or build within the wetlands. Those are the defining factors. So yes, you could thank glaciers.
Bill?
Yeah, a couple of reflections and a question. The wildlife underpasses, as you mentioned, we faced 15 years ago a unique opportunity with the replacement of the Dobie Road Bridge to establish an undercrossing, and the road department and the road commission engineers had choice words for our planning staff when that came up during the permitting process. In the end, we kind of got an undercrossing and it's working really well. Trying to put bike lanes on our roads was a huge battle back in the day. In the last couple of years, the county road department has done a half a dozen safety conversions with 4 lanes to 2 each way with a center turn lane and bike lanes. So it's been a kind of a monumental shift in that agency's approach to roads and in our township. The big question that I'm wrestling with now is, as we look at that eastern third of the township outside the urban service boundary, as Tim was saying, most of our development is kind of infill at the moment. Eventually, we expect that eastern third to come under that development pressure. And the big question for us, I think, is under what conditions would we like to see that happen? When folks do start building out there, what would we like to see happen, and how can we incentivize that? In terms of wetlands, when I first joined the Environmental Commission, we were getting wetland use permit applications 3-4 times a year. It's a huge amount of work for the commission. We haven't seen a wetland use permit application in a couple of years now. And my sense from the planning staff is that's partly a function of places already having been built, but also largely a function of applicants being aware that that's an extra hurdle, and they're basically submitting plans that avoid any wetland impact. So that wetland protection ordinance has kind of really worked. So those are just sort of some thoughts on my end.
Yeah, Bill, the whole eastern side, and this goes to Tim's thing, it sounds like the sewer service boundary hasn't changed or changed significantly since the plan was done 20 years ago. That is probably your biggest challenge of holding the line, if you will, of, you know, trying to make sure that that doesn't expand, because I'm sure you're getting pressure from developers to try to get sewer out there, and that would, to my mind, is what's preserving that area out there. The hedgerows, I think we still have dirt roads out there, and some maybe not, because that was one of the things where, like, if you're going to put trails out there, don't put them along the road, put them on the other side of the hedgerow, preserve the hedgerow in that kind of rural feel, because I think we've all seen the rural area that may be farmed that all of a sudden turns into, you know, everyone has 3-acre mowed grass, and it takes away that whole road character. So I think those things are key, but it would seem to me your zoning is pretty low key. The restriction on what you could probably get a septic system in there, and the combination of limiting the sewer, that should do a lot. But Tim, I'd be curious to see what your thoughts are on this. Is that enough?
I mean, I think the practical issue, I mean, the thing I tell people with the urban service boundary is there's not a cheap way to get sewer functionally past Powell Road, right? There's already there's a private force main that serves the church. But outside, and that, which you really can't tap into a force main in a traditional sense. Like, it's a much more complicated process. Plus, it wasn't sized for anything. Like, running sewer, because we have a mobile home park out at Van Atta and Grand River, which is a constant problem. And there's always conversation of, okay, what if we, you know, let's do affordable housing there, let's redevelop it. The problem is getting services out there is prohibitively expensive, to the point where it's not something the township's ever just going to do, right? It's going to have to be, if it ever came about, it would have to be something that's funded by an outside agency, and no developer is going to do it because we're never going to give them any sort of density where they can recoup their investment. And so I think we're at a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy now of, like, Powell Road is functionally the edge. I mean, it's not, you're going to get the development that can tap into the existing Powell Road sewers, and that's pretty much it. Now I say that, and I'm sure something will change financially or in the housing market dramatically, and my words will be eaten in a couple of years. But, you know, as it stands right now, it's just not feasible. And so you have the people that do the one-off lots, or, you know, we got a guy on Van Atta trying to do a lot split right now to add a second house. But that's really what we see. And even in some of those cases, the septic is a challenge. You know, if you got an engineer field, adds thousands and thousands of dollars to your cost, and, you know, in some cases that kills the deal. It's an interesting. I think if the church wasn't out that far, it would be just pure rural once you get past Powell Road, really. But with the church being out there, you sort of get this sense of, okay, there's more to come. And it just is not realistic to happen. I mean, we looked at a house out there and we looked at a house off Meridian Road, actually, as far out as you can get. And it was on well and septic, and my wife grew up on it. And I never did. And so I was all skeptical of it. Instead bought the house she liked that I'm now still continually fixing up, because why would I buy the house that was in good shape?
What church are you referring to?
St. Martha's.
It'll be interesting because now we're talking septic is finally on the forefront and state legislation discussions.
Absolutely. That's a whole nother thing. If the state comes in and sort of changes what can happen there, or from a maintenance perspective, even just that there has to be more money put into it. What does that change?
Yeah, and it sounds like more ambitious rather than just transfer a title kind of. So, I mean, from a water quality standpoint, that's probably the most significant thing you could do in the township, is to have that ordinance come into place.
Yeah, that would be huge I feel like the state needs to give us a little cover here to make sure that we can get away with that. But yeah, that'd be enormous. Because you're right. In the state of Michigan, that's one of our biggest. I don't know. I don't want to say hidden, because I think a lot of people realize that when you have septic adjacent to lakes and rivers and stuff, it's not good. But it's out of sight, out of mind of a lot of people.
Bill talked about your build out analysis, and I think we kind of flew by that one slide that talked about the biggest change or potential build out we looked at 20 years ago, the disparity between what you could build and what was actually on the site. And you had talked about it's pretty well a built out community now, and now it's into the redevelopment of parcels. So I think Bill wanted you to kind of maybe expand on that, at least I saw in the chat.
Brian, you want to talk about where we've started on that?
Sure. So you looked around our website, you saw that we recently updated our master plan, our comprehensive plan for the township. And one of the pieces of background for that we worked on was a preliminary build out analysis. And we presented those findings to the Planning Commission in May of last year. When you do all the math, you come up with a theoretical total of 3,828 total units. Now that's taken the zoning into account on parcels that haven't been built, and that's both inside and outside of the urban service boundary. And we acknowledge that we have more work to do, and I've started using ArcGIS and to take a look at what parcels are in and out, but I haven't got to the point where I can talk about the buildability of those or anything like that. But that's just kind of where we're at. So we think about 3,500 more units total. I can get more specific. That's just the final count.
And when it comes to the mix of commercial versus residential, and are you seeing a lot of, okay, it's something that's maybe outlived its usefulness, like a old strip development, and kind of getting redeveloped as a higher density mixed use? Is that pressure beginning to kind of kick in?
Some places, we have two mixed use developments that are, one is almost done. That's American House on Hazlitt Road, and Newton Point is a mixed use development that was actually approved before I started here, and that's in the process of being built. We have two other mixed use developments that are mired in site plan issues right now. Tim, correct me if you think I'm wrong. I think we're seeing more commercial redevelopment of sites. You know,
Oh, yeah, I mean,
restaurant goes out of business. Hey, we want to put a car wash there. But they're not going into new sites by and large.
yeah, Hazlitt Village Square, the shopping center was torn down. It'll be
Yeah.
a mixed use project. They've started construct. Well, they've done demo. They're
Yeah.
meeting with them next week, talk about next stages. I mean, the Trader Joe's that's coming into town was a redevelopment of a
Yeah.
underperforming strip mall. The the building next door to that's probably gonna get torn down. It's been vacant for as long as I can remember. It's an old 2-story bank from it's an old design Bank of America. So yeah, I mean, I think we're starting to see that more and more of these underperforming commercial shopping centers. The original owners are looking to retire and time to move on. And that's where we look at, okay, well, by right, you can put apartments on the second floor of any commercial structure by right. And there's ways to get to higher density if you really want to do a project. And so that's, creating that density along the transit corridor, along the existing infrastructure routes is, I think, kind of the key going forward for us.
I had a quick question. Sam, go ahead. You raised your hand before I did.
Oh, that's okay. If you had a quick question, that's fine. Jump in.
Well, just a general question about what do you find in communities? Do you think it seems like we're fairly informed and yet we're speaking a language that's not common to everyday citizenry? And maybe that's the advantage of engaging the entire community in this process, but wondering how much is that as an issue as we contemplate some of these topics that are maybe not on the radar for the average citizen.
No, we planners, landscape architects, we all have our language, and we have to be careful, because you're right, it is a language. But I think the question in public engagement is always, what is the character, or what are the things that you want to preserve? And that's where you kind of get that, I want to preserve the natural areas. I want trails to go access new parks and get away from the language. But I think all of the public engagement from before was, people saw a township in, well, let's say, I've always teased Meridian Township a little bit. It's a city that has not quite accepted that it's a city yet, and there is that desire to keep the township name in what rural and natural characteristics. I think this fear of accepting a city title with it, people strongly want to preserve that rural character to the degree they can, because they saw so much of it disappear over the preceding years.
Thank you. Go ahead, Sam.
Sure. Well, I guess, first of all, Norm, I really enjoyed your, the discussion, the first part of this presentation there. And I'm, again, totally amazed with the work you're doing and what you did back in the day when these ideas of green infrastructure corridors, greenways, whatever you want to call them, and everybody had a different idea what they were, but you were taking it really to the next level of, the science of looking at these ecosystems and how to connect them as routes for wildlife. And it's not just people with green, paths and so forth, but it's the routes that the critters take. So I think that was one of the great things about the plan, even though you kind of underrated it. You kind of sounded like you didn't do a great job of it, but you were the only guy doing it. It wasn't even a thing. And I think Meridian Township's really lucky to have that plan at such an early stage. So kudos to you, Norm. But when you started talking about what's maybe missing, and just some thoughts that sort of popped in my head. with things that weren't thought about then, the idea of climate change and, the whole loss of biodiversity. So now, maybe if we did take this plan, and aside from all the great things it does for planning, all the other aspects of planning, but just the green corridors themselves, take a deeper dive into that and solidify those connections that you talked about might be missing, but also maybe a little more analysis about, like what you mentioned, the kinds of habitat that are making use of that. You get a little bit more detail of what critters are doing it and what's living there and what's needed and what's missing, where the invasive species might be, and some more thought about how to enhance those corridors for the benefit of our upcoming crisis, with the whole climate change issue, knowing that we got to do something about that, right? And it's all about, a stronger green infrastructure and of course, eliminating carbon emissions. But on the other side is recreating that carbon sink that needs to handle whatever we spew out there. So how to take a look at what we have and enhance that, scientifically might be something to consider. That's all. Just thinking about that.
Well, yeah, Sam, just a couple of things. One, we weren't the only people doing this. We were relying on great research by many other people. There were other organizations.
You're way too humble,
doing this.
Norm. You were like in front of all of this.
But we're practitioners. We take the good ideas of many people and try to throw them together for a particular place or time. But I think to your point of, we talk about buzzwords and planning, resiliency was the key one a few years ago in the whole climate change. I don't think you need a whole redo of these corridors in analysis and all that. And you probably could you spend a lot of time and energy coming up with a very similar answer to what we did 20 years ago, minus what has, changed development or the other study that was done. But to your point, what is almost needed is more of a management plan of saying, okay, this little fragile corridor here along this stream going between these big commercial developments, it's just choked with invasive, it's full of garbage.
Yeah.
The banks, we're getting a lot of erosion there. It's a whole nother level of ecological assessment and action plan for particularly fragile corridors to make sure they function. And I think that's, and you already have your natural features where you're doing the prescribed burns, and so it's almost seems like a expansion of those type of areas, and make sure that as we look at the climate change and our streams are much more flashy, we're getting these huge downpours, and the streams function very differently than they did 50, 60 years ago. Plus you add on the development aspect of mile draining there. These streams are just a totally different creature than they were a long time ago. And what do we need to do to rethink and make sure that they function as best they can? Because I think it's a detailed management action plan on the specifics rather than a broad brush. We need to do these type of things. At least that's my gut on this element.
I think that's what I was kind of what I was thinking. I mean, it just depends on how far you want to take it in detail. I mean, there is sort of a broad brush management plan that can then be even taken into greater detail. It just depends on how far you want to go all in one big step.
Yeah, and then to the element of, so if that is the green space element, continuing and pushing a little bit further, the whole alternative transportation, multimodal transportation element of making sure with the transit, that you're having the road crossing opportunities that are safe, and that is tying in directly to the bicycle and pedestrian systems that link into the neighborhoods, and revisiting and making sure that those are up to current standards and best practices. So less dependence on the automobile, and as you use things like zoning and mixed use, and more people could take some daily trips to the store by bike or foot. So I think, it's refinement rather than broad brush concept on some things.
This has been a very inspiring overview, and really appreciate your perspective on this, Norm. We have about 5 more minutes. Does anyone who hasn't had a chance to speak want to say a word or two, or have a question for Norm? Kim?
Yeah, this is outside the township kind of question, but I saw the documentary about the building of 496 here in Lansing a couple of weeks ago. And there was, as I was watching it, I mean, the main theme of the documentary is the decimation of the Black neighborhood that was destroyed, when they ran an expressway through there. But secondarily, that expressway not only destroyed, that immediate community, but it was the beginning of the downfall of the downtown area in Lansing. What it did is it exacerbated white flight. People were able to live farther away and still get downtown to work and then leave. It decimated a walkable community that would have supported downtown restaurants and stores and things like that. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about the way we went about, just running highways and roads willy-nilly throughout the state.
We don't have another 3 days in this meeting, but yeah, I think
Understood.
that's a whole big discussion and near and dear to my heart. And I think we'll just leave it with just a few thoughts. People spend the same amount of time doing the same type of trips now than they did 2,000 years ago. Oh, Leroy, we're out of time here. So
No, we can go a few minutes over. I
Okay.
don't want to cut you off.
I've got to bounce. I apologize. Norm,
Oh.
thanks for everything, man. It was good to talk to you.
Good to talk to you. See you around.
Thank you, Tim, for your comments.
But what I was saying is, like, people will take 10 minutes to do their kind of daily chores, 15 minutes to do their weekly going shopping or something like that, 15-20 minutes, and maxing out around a half hour for commuting to work. And over centuries, what we have just done is expand the distance that are related to those time that allocate to the trips. We have a little bit of a reset when it came to the pandemic and people working from home. But as we think about transportation, it's really, can we get things close enough to each other where that 10-minute trip makes more sense walking or biking than it does getting in the car, where it's the easiest, most logical choice on things. And then take down the things that are inhibiting our trips, whether it's a freeway that is bisecting stuff, but there's so many friction points of, do I feel safe doing this trip? Do I feel safe getting across the road? Those type of things. So I look at a lot of our work is really trying to remove the friction points that are stopping people from doing the type of where walking and bicycling is not something you're trying to convince someone to do, but something that they just do because that's the way they want to do it. Now, the historical location and of transportation facilities, that's something we really need to kind of address and fix the inequities that were done. But again, we could talk about that from hours and days.
Thank you.
Well, I hope we can have you back, Norm, or maybe you, Sam, and Wendy can put together a next step with help from Brian and Tim and others. But I hope we have you back and tap more of your creativity. It's very generous of you to spend an hour with us. Any other parting comments from anybody?
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Norm.
Thank
That
you,
was
everyone.
really interesting.
Good to see everybody.
Great to see you,
Thank
Norm.
you.
And you too, Wendy.
Yep.
Have a
Bye.
great day, folks. We'll be in touch, hopefully.